Good afternoon, everyone. Shall we start?
Good afternoon, sir.
Okay, good afternoon. Okay, let's go ahead.
Yes, sir.
So we'll be discussing about the environmental hazards and disasters. So hazards and disasters are no new topic for anyone. Actually, everyone learn something about hazard and disasters from class 6, 7. Maybe from first class onwards, they do have some idea about what we mean by hazard and some what we mean by disasters. Now, because this actually poses a great threat to the human beings, and when the living beings are affected, we need to understand those phenomena which are actually impacting our life. So that is why we are basically concerned about all these kind of hazards and disasters. So most of them are when we are looking into the concept of hazard, it is somewhat different from disasters. But to be frank, we basically use these two terms in related manners. I mean, we sometimes use hazard, we sometimes use disaster. But in geographical concepts, now when we'll be understanding about its core concept, then it is something different. Okay, so what do you mean by hazard? Hazard is basically a potential threat. So that is what we call hazard. So any potential threat that can be called as hazard. I mean, that can be from nature, that can be from the man-made hazards, just like air pollution, water pollution. So all these are kind of hazards. Now, because air pollution is actually impacting the human lives, air pollution is impacting the human health. So that is why we are facing some potential threats from air pollution. That is why we are very much concerned about the air pollution. So whenever we are concerned about something, that means it is basically a potential threat. Now, when it is acting as a potential threat, then we can consider that as hazard. So what is hazard? So it is basically a phenomena that poses a threat, a future source of danger, or having the potential to cause harm to people and their environment, bringing death, injury, diseases, stress, or often become a disaster. Now, hazards become disaster when it becomes disasters. Now, we'll be discussing about the concept of disasters later, but let's understand what is hazard first. Here, the definition has been given by the ADPC of Bangkok, that hazards are basically events which become a potential cause of harm or loss. And sometimes it is basically defined as those elements of physical environment harmful to man caused by forces extraneous to him. So these are basically hazards. I mean, all the things like volcanic eruption, earthquakes, cyclones, flood, landslide, train accidents. Yeah, I have given you some man-made hazards, just like given examples of man-made hazards, just like air pollution, water pollution, anything. So all these are basically causing potential threat to the mankind, to the living, the living organisms. So that is why we are considering that as hazard. Then when we will be considering the same thing as disaster, when its impact, it is the occurrence actually has caused the the death of people or has damaged a lot of properties, then we can simply call that as a disaster. I mean, any earthquake, or let's say the volcanic eruption that is occurring in mid-oceanic regions. Now, because that is a continuous process which is happening in mid-oceanic regions. So maybe it is a potential threat. So that is why we can consider that as hazard. But in actual terms, if it is not, not impacting the lives of human, the lives of living beings, then we cannot simply consider that as disaster. Now, because there will be hazards occurring anywhere in the world or anywhere in the globe, so we can simply consider each and every hazard as disaster. So in that way, disasters are different from the hazards. And this kind of hazards and disasters can be now divided into man-made or natural hazards or disasters. So let's first let's again try to understand what we mean by hazard. Hazard basically refers to that potential source of harm or adverse health effect on a person or no on a person or persons. So that is basically the threat on the living beings. Hazards can be natural, such as earthquakes, hurricanes, man-made, such as chemical spill or radiation. Hazard becomes a concern when it poses a level of threat to life, health, property, or environment. Then what are basically disaster? So disasters are basically the events that occur when a hazard actually impact the society. So all those are basically hazards. Earthquake is a hazard, tsunamis are hazard, you have cyclones are hazard. But if those events are not impacting the lives of the human beings or living organisms, then we cannot simply consider that as disaster. So that is why a disaster is basically an event that occurs when hazard actually impacts the society, and that basically causing significant damage, destruction or disruption of normal life. So disasters often result in casualties, property loss, and environmental damage, and requires external assistance for recovery. So the severity of a disaster depends on both the impact of hazard itself and the vulnerability of affected population. So here comes the word vulnerability, and what do you mean by vulnerability and risk? Because you need to understand what is vulnerability and what is risk in the context of hazard and disaster. So vulnerability is basically the susceptibility, okay, the susceptibility to harm, and primarily when exposed to hazards. I mean, how vulnerable you are to hazards. Now let's suppose you are living in an earthquake prone area. Okay, so if you are living in an earthquake prone region, that means all the people who are living in those areas are basically vulnerable to earthquake. So that is basically the vulnerability. So there can be different types of vulnerability. So vulnerability is a study of probability of a natural or man-made event that leaves adverse impact on people or their assets due to the occurrence. Okay. Now here, the example of flood has been given. If you are living nearby the river banks, or if you are living near the floodplains, then the chances are that if flood will occur, then you will be impacted. So that is basically the scenario or the case of vulnerability. Now, to what extent you are exposed to the hazards or disasters that will be called as vulnerability. Okay, so the vulnerability can be of different types now, because we can't simply define the vulnerability on physical terms only, although there will be physical vulnerability. So physical vulnerability basically depends on the location of people, infrastructure, and resources as well, technical capacity of structures and built environment. Now let's suppose, now just like I have given example of earthquake prone region, the people who are living in earthquake prone region, they are physically vulnerable to earthquakes. Why? No, because they are already living in some kind of earthquake prone regions. So that is why they are physically vulnerable, because of their location and infrastructure. Infrastructure is basically, now let's suppose you do have a, let's say, concrete house. You and you are living nearby the coastal regions, and no cyclones are expected maybe next day. So think about another person who is having earthen house, and their family will also be facing the cyclones. Okay, so among these two families, if we will be understanding the concept of vulnerability, the Arden House family members are much more vulnerable towards the cyclones now, because the wind speed will be more. There will be pretty amount of rainfall that can occur, and that can actually destruct the earthen house. So all these kind of vulnerabilities, so they are facing right now, because the infrastructure here is not good, or infrastructure here is not good for them. So that is why they are more vulnerable. Now you can take the example of, let's say, Odisha, and let's say Andhra Pradesh. So if the the infrastructural facilities to face any cyclones in Odisha is superior as compared to the Andhra Pradesh, then we can simply say that Odisha is less vulnerable towards the cyclone. This is basically a hypothetical example. Don't compare. I don't have actual data right now. So we can simply say that uh, the coastal line, and basically the people who are living nearby the coast, are less vulnerable towards cyclone as compared to Andhra Pradesh. Now, because Odisha have actually better infrastructural facilities to combat the cyclone as a hazard. So that is why we can simply consider this infrastructure uh, as one of the primary component or critical component of physical vulnerability. Then how resources, as well as technical capacity of structure, uh, that also that is also another component of physical vulnerability. Because if you will be having resources and technical capacity, then you can simply escape the disasters. So in that case, you are less vulnerable. I mean, if you do have resources, now let's say the drought occurred, and you do have, let's say, financial resources, or let's say you do have already reserve of food items. So what does that really mean? Even though the drought occurred, you are less vulnerable towards hunger, towards that drought. Now drought is basically a hazard, and it can be a disaster in agricultural regions. So in that case, if you do have resources, then you are less vulnerable. Now think about poor people who don't have any stocks, who don't have any reserves of food. So then they will be much more vulnerable towards uh, the drought condition or that hazard. Okay, so these are basically uh, that is basically the physical vulnerability. I mean, all kind of, let's say, infrastructural facilities, that's just like building sites, design, shape, materials used, construction techniques, maintenance, and proximity of buildings to other, that also defines or determines the vulnerability, the physical vulnerability basically. Then you do have economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability basically, uh, the primary element is basically the economy. I mean, that is basically related to resources. That is basically related to your money. Okay, so if you do have money, then you are, maybe you are less vulnerable towards hazards. I mean, if you do do have ample amount of money that can actually uh, help you surviving for a longer period of time. Now, even though, let's say, even though a drought occurred, or let's say in case of other other things, I mean, any kind of hazards that is occurring, then you can simply escape that. I mean, let's think about any region which is highly, no, the air pollution is very high, and it is highly toxic. Now, if you do have money, then you can simply escape that place, and you can live in other regions, so which is suitable, which is having a suitable climatic condition. So what does that really mean? You here, the concept of vulnerability is reduced for you in that case of hazard, because you are not facing that hazard right now. So that is why, the economic, this is basically the economic vulnerability. Then social vulnerability, I mean, social vulnerabilities, we can simply consider there are few groups or few group of people who are more vulnerable towards any hazard. Now, you can think about child, you can think about women, or you can think about some tribes which are living in any earthquake prone region. So those people or those human beings are more vulnerable towards any hazard. So that is basically social vulnerability. Other than this kind of vulnerability, you can also have institutional vulnerability. I mean, institutional vulnerability simply means, the aspect such as governance and public policies. I think the effectiveness of institutions in managing the impact of the hazards. I mean, if the government is doing very good works, and there is proper institutional management, then the that concept is pretty much related to institutional vulnerability. So then what happens, the uh, if the institutions are properly functioning, and they are doing their work properly, and you do have proper, let's say, mitigational measures, and those institutions are working on different disaster mitigations projects and anything. So in that way, what happens? The institutional vulnerability basically reduces as compared to other regions. Now let's suppose some countries, they do not have much ideas about facing any cyclones. Let's say, okay, um, so Odisha faces cyclones, every 2 to 3 years, or maybe 4 to 5 years. Now or then, Odisha, uh, the past history of Odisha is saying all about it. So Odisha actually know how to mitigate the the impact of cyclones uh, in a better manner. And I believe the institutions or the institutional vulnerability here in Odisha is pretty less as compared to other regions, or as compared to other states also. Now, because they haven't developed much institutions which are mostly focusing on the cyclones. So I'm just talking about the cyclones, not other disasters. Okay. So in a way, the institutions are much more aware about the cyclones. Now, let's suppose some countries or some states, those who will be facing any cyclone and do not have any institutional facilities, then what will happen? So definitely they will be much more, vulnerable towards that cyclone. That is basically a hazard. So then that concept is pretty much related to your institutional vulnerability. Even you can have environmental vulnerability. That depends how you are defining vulnerability. Then what do you mean by risk, and how risk is different from that of vulnerability? Now, risk is the primary concept. Okay, risk is the primary concept, while the vulnerability is basically, it is basically now the potential threat. Okay, although risk is also that, but whenever you are considering risk, risk is what? Risk is basically the vulnerability plus the hazard. That is basically the risk in total terms. Okay. So what is risk? Whenever you are saying, let's say the cyclone will occur at Odisha coast. Okay. So there are now n number of people who are living in Odisha coast, and we do have cyclone centers, this much of cyclone centers, and that cyclone center can we can afford to have this much of people. Then this is basically, we are we are basically analyzing the risk factor. Okay, now we do understand who are vulnerable, what is the physical vulnerability, what is the economic vulnerability, and what is the social vulnerability. That is something different. So the vulnerability plus that hazard, whenever we are considering these two terms, then we are basically getting the risk. Okay, so the risk can simply be defined as, the expected damage or loss, or basically other adverse effects that is resulting from a specific hazard for a given area, or for a period of time. So that is basically risk. So there are three essential components in determination of risk, so which should be separately quantified. So these components are hazard occurrence. Hazard occurrence is basically the probability of a hazard event happening at a location or a region. Then a risk element. What is risk element? Risk element is basically identifying and making an inventory of people, buildings, or other elements which are likely to be affected by hazards, and where required, estimating their economic values. Okay, then third one is basically your vulnerability of the element at risk. So these are the three things that I have told you. The risk, the hazard, and the vulnerability. So the risk is the important concept here. Now, because your hazard plus the vulnerability. Now, although we are not considering the exposure factor here, the exposure is altogether a different concept. We can simply consider exposure as other factor also. We, instead of including exposure into the vulnerability concept, we can include the exposure factor to a different concept, and we can include that also. So risk is basically hazard plus vulnerability plus exposure, or you can simply say that risk is hazard plus the vulnerability. Disaster risk reduction approach and strategies. There are different institutions which are working for disaster risk reduction. I mean, we have understood the concept of risk. So, disaster risk reduction is basically when we are working to reduce the risk of that disaster, or that is basically your disaster risk reduction. So, I think you know about the NDMA, so Disaster Management Act, and after after a disaster management act, the NDMA was established. So NDMA is basically your national disaster management authority. agencies. Sorry. So what are the different approaches? First is basically adoption of mitigation measures through the use of technology, indigenous wisdom, and environmental sustainability. So this way we can actually reduce the risk of any disaster. Mitigation measures, I mean, through the use of technology, if we can reduce the impact of any hazard, then uh, this this is basically a new approach for us. Then indigenous wisdom, I mean, indigenous wisdom is basically if people are practicing something from the past, from the ancient time, and that is sustainable even in contemporary times or even in modern times, then we can simply implement those kind of indigenous wisdom or indigenous knowledge to equip our mitigation strategies in a better way. Then environmental sustainability, so that is also important. Then mainstreaming disaster management into the state's development planning. I mean, if any state is not mainstreaming the disaster management into its development planning, then it will be lagging behind. Why? Lagging behind. Why? Now, because if a disaster will occur, then it will simply disrupt the developmental progress, the growth of that economy. No, no, because they cannot simply survive, you know they cannot simply tackle the impact of the disaster. So that is why any government should mainstream the disaster management into its development planning, establishing institutional and techno-legal setup for identification, monitoring, and assessment of disaster risk. So this is also important. Now, only mainstreaming the disaster management. Now, although mainstreaming the disaster management can actually help in establishing, the institutions, different types of institutions, just like now here in Odisha, we do have OSDMA, that is basically Odisha State Disaster Management Agency, and which is basically looking after the disasters, the disaster management of our state. I mean, how to mitigate, how to get prepared. So, then warning system. So, all these kind of things are basically done by OSDMA. Now, although there are different central agencies and central institutions which are looking after the disasters of the country, but still the states also do have a disaster management institution. Different disaster management institutions do help in different types of hazards or cyclones. I mean, there are different NGOs who are also working to mitigate disa- different disaster activities in different parts of our country, and even in different states. So all these are other approaches we can simply take into consideration for reducing the disaster risk. I mean, improving forecasting and early warning systems, and fail-safe communication. So if we can simply improve the technology which can forecast about the disasters, then it will actually help us. Let's say evacuate. We need to evacuate people from, let's say, the coastal region. Then what will happen? We need to uh, know when the cyclones will occur, or when the disasters will occur. So then what will happen? I mean, if we will not have any idea about when the cyclone will occur, then we cannot simply evacuate uh, 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 a lot of people from at a large scale. So that will be a tough task for anyone. So what happens, so you need warning system, you need forecasting system. Now, right now the cyclone forecasting system is great. No, in India, IMD also issues early warning about the cyclones, the low pressure that if any low pressures are basically identified in Arabian Sea or Bay of Bengal. So although Bay of Bengal is much more prone to cyclone occurrence now, because the pre-existing low pressure cells actually get activated mostly during the post monsoon season. So that is why most of the cyclones occur in the Bay of Bengal rather than in Arabian Sea. Now, although few cyclones occur in Arabian Sea also, but most of the time you will be seeing during post monsoon season, the cyclones will occur in Bay of Bengal. Then promoting collaboration and partnership with media, national and international organizations to create awareness and capacity building of stakeholders. So capacity building of stakeholders is very important. I mean, if you are, let's say, you are providing infrastructural facility. I mean, you are what you are actually doing. You are doing the capacity building of the stakeholders. I mean, who are the stakeholders here? All the people are the stakeholders here. The people who are prone, people who are vulnerable towards the hazard. So when you are improving the infrastructural facility, just like cyclone shelters are there nearby the coastal regions, so that it can accommodate a lot of, you know, a lot of population. So what happens then if if these cyclone shelters wouldn't have been there? Then what will happen? I mean, if cyclone occurs at a point of time, then those people will not get that facility. So in a way, these infrastructures actually providing the capacity building. Okay, and we need to collaborate with media and other national and international organizations. Now, just like we do have national institutions, there are different international institutions which are looking after the disasters of different countries. I mean, UN is also there. There are different parts of UN which are looking after the disasters of the globe, and different countries do have their disaster management authorities and institutions. So if you do have some knowledge about disaster management, then you need to collaborate with other institutions and share with other countries now, because disaster is a global problem. I mean, if you do have better technology, if you do have better ideas and indigenous wisdom and knowledge, then you need to share with other countries or other institutions, so that people will be benefited. It is basically the mankind who will be benefited from from tackling the impacts of or the effects of disaster. Then ensuring efficient and quick response and relief to vulnerable and poorer sections of the community. So I do remember in 1999, after the 1999 super cyclone, I mean, the flood has taken a lot of things of people. Okay, so I do remember, uh, the government people, they provided the relief facilities. I mean, they have provided food, uh, blankets and some other stuffs. I don't remember exactly, but to some extent I do remember. I was a child at that time, and so these are necessary. I mean, you need to quickly respond to any disaster activity. I mean, if you cannot quickly respond, then the impact will be more. I mean, although the physical impact is something different, but the impact on life, the impact on property, and the damage it can, it can actually do, that can be reduced. Okay, so that is why it need efficient and quick response and relief. Building back better system, taking a disaster as an opportunity. Okay, you can go through this. Okay, so these are the pretty much approaches you can go ahead, and we can actually reduce the risk of disasters. And here are some other approaches. approach of preparedness and response. I think whether we do have disaster management cycle, I don't remember exactly. But a disaster management, within disaster management cycle, you do have preparedness, response, mitigation, and also um, those are basically a cyclic process of disaster management. You can go through these approaches also. These are what I have discussed in the previous section also. Just like vulnerability reduction approach, how can we reduce the vulnerability? Then community centered approach, I mean the community will be the pivot, the center of this approach. I mean this approach actually gives different roles and responsibilities to the community owners. Okay, so in disaster management, I mean if those people will be suffering and those people will be facing that disaster, then they can simply work and take different roles and responsibility so that the impact of those disasters can be reduced. So here you do have a Sendai framework and disaster management, and the framework basically was introduced in 1900. Sendai framework, sorry, 2015 only. So it is developed keeping in view of the guidelines of the Hyogo framework and Yokohama strategy for disaster resilience for communities. Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction was actually formulated as a global strategy uh, for increasing resilience and reducing the impact of disasters through policy intervention, proactive governance, national and international collaboration, use of ICT, and innovative research, capacity building of stakeholders, and preparedness of community members. So all these things are basically included under the Sendai framework. Okay, so Sendai is in Japan, and the meeting that was held here in Japan, actually these are the important points that has been discussed. And what are the objectives? So they basically targeted on increasing the resilience of people. And now let's suppose how we can increase the resilience of, let's say, the coastal area people for tackling the cyclones. So either providing different infrastructural facilities, or we can simply use different technological you know uh, different technology to no the reduce the impact of cyclones. So in that way also we can simply tackle the disaster. So what are the characteristic features of the Sendai declarations? So first one is goals and outcome. The goal and objective outlined in Sendai recommendation to achieve disaster resilience by 2030. So what are they? Substantial reduction of disaster risk with respect to loss of life, livelihood, economic, physical, social, and environmental asset of community and countries. So this is the first objective, or basically the goal. Then you do have prevention of new disaster risk and reduction in the existing risks by implementing and integrating an inclusive structural, economic, legal, social, environmental, political, and institutional measure that reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disaster. So that basically assists in preparedness for response and recovery of strengthening resilience to disasters. I mean, goals, what are the different objectives and goals by 2030? So these are the goals. Then priorities. So there are four priorities. First one is understanding about the risk of disasters. So this is important one now, because First, you need to understand about the risk of disaster. So it emphasized open the risk of disaster. I mean, if it is basically the vulnerability plus the hazard, the Himalayan regions. So all the regions of Himalayas actually do have some sort of, you know, some sort of vulnerability in terms of earthquake as an hazard. Now, because the plate is still active. I mean, the tectonic plate is still active. So that is why there can be, there can be earthquake that can occur, that may occur. Sorry, that may occur. So that is basically the vulnerability concept. I mean, that is the vulnerability, and the earthquake is the hazard. So we need to understand the risk. First, what is the risk? I mean, how many people are living there, and what is their infrastructure? I mean, if at any point of time earthquake occur, then whether they can, they can tackle that earthquake or not. So all these kind of things should be assessed or should be understood about any disaster. So this priority tends to highlight that the disaster managers must understand the nature and characteristics of disaster risk and its associated components like vulnerability, exposure, capacity, and preparedness in relation to the people and their assets. So this is what I was explaining about the the earthquake example. Okay, so knowledge will be significant in disaster prevention and mitigation as well as the emergency preparedness, response, and post-disaster rehabilitation and reconstruction. So always remember there are basically 3 to 4 stages of disaster management cycle. I don't remember exactly, but it is basically about preparedness, then about the ongoing disaster activity. I mean, how you can actually respond to that. Then the post disaster, within post disaster, what you can do so that the impact can be mitigated. So that is basically your post disaster management. So rehabilitation and reconstruction. So all these kind of things can be done in post disaster management. Emphasis on proactive governance. I mean, proactive governance, and you do understand what do you mean by active governance. So here, the Sendai framework actually recommended the proactive governance of different states. I mean, different countries and different the institutions which are concerned about the disaster management. They should be, they should be proactive about managing the disaster. So that is what the proactive governance is all about. I mean, we have discussed about mainstreaming the uh, the disaster management into the development plans. I mean, if you are mainstreaming that idea, I mean, mainstreaming the disaster management into the development policy, then what will happen? I mean, you will be proactively managing the disaster. So then what will happen? I mean, the impact of disasters will be reduced for sure. Okay. So invest in DRR activities and community resilience. DRR is basically disaster risk reduction. So when government, okay, so when government will be investing in disaster risk reduction, then definitely, I mean, if government is spending on disaster resilient infrastructure and it is spending on community resilience, it is spending on, let's say, buying some technology from other countries or from other institutions which do have the technology to tackle those kind of disasters. So that is fine. I mean, that is that should be done. That has been recommended by the Sendai framework. Then enhancing preparedness of effective response and building back better in reconstruction, recovery, and rehabilitation. So this is about the post disaster. I mean, Okay, so everything has been done. The cyclone has occurred, or maybe the earthquake has occurred. So right now, what we can actually do to mitigate further impact of earthquakes, or let's say landslides, or let's say cyclones, or let's say flood or drought or anything. I mean, if drought has occurred in those regions where most of the people are primarily engaged in agricultural activity, then a lot of people will be having further impacts. They will be facing further impacts of that drought condition. Why? Because most of the agricultural people who are engaged in agricultural activities are very poor. Okay, so they don't have much reserve, they don't have much economic resources. Now, although few may do have economic resources, they can escape that drought condition, but government should respond very quickly to any drought conditions. I mean, so that the agricultural family should not suffer further. I mean, if the drought has been occurred, and because that is natural in nature, so the government need to understand that and quickly respond to those kind of activities. Okay, so that is basically managing the post disaster in a very active manner. So, what is community preparedness? Community preparedness in disaster management, it basically enables community members to address the disaster risk reduction. That is basically the DRR process, pursuing disaster preparedness and response. I mean, if some people are more vulnerable towards, let's say, some kind of disasters or some kind of hazards, so they need to understand about the disaster risk reduction. They need to understand about that particular disaster. I mean, if the coastal areas are more vulnerable towards the cyclone, then they need to understand the cyclone. They need to understand how we can simply mitigate the impacts of cyclone to to a very meager terms. So if that can be done, I mean, that is basically the community resilience. That is basically the community-based preparedness. I mean, the community, that community. Now, let's suppose the community we are basically talking about. Let's say the districts, okay, the coastal districts. Now, let's say the Jagat Singhpur district is the people of Jagat Singh district are basically much more aware about, let's say, cyclonic activities, and they have received the warning system. They started responding immediately. They 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 got into the cyclone shelters and all these kind of activities, let's say. Okay, so they are much more prepared. That is basically the community based preparedness. And let's say, as compared to that, if, let's say, Puri, okay, so Puri is not that prepared, or the people of Puri and who are basically living nearby the coastal regions, those are not very much prepared. Then what will happen? The impact of cyclone, now even though the intensity of cyclone will be, let's say, the similar. So even though there is similar intensity of cyclone, but the people of Puri will be having larger impacts. They will be seeing larger impacts as compared to the people of Jagatsinghpur. Why? Now because they are not prepared. So that is basically community-based preparedness. We will be awareing those communities which are vulnerable to a certain hazard type, and then we'll help them learn about the disaster risk reduction. I mean, all the regions which are flood prone. Then what are the different things that can be done? Will be I mean, there are different agencies and different institutions. Those will be teaching those communities about how we can escape the impacts of flood. Okay, so life is much more important. Okay, so there can be, there will be, the property will be damaged. to some extent, that is fine, but life is much more important. So what are the principles and premises behind the community based disaster management? Community based disaster preparedness can be responsive and based on the urgency of the community felt needs. So what is the actual needs of the community? So that is much more important. So that is why community based disaster preparedness no is important. So these are basically the principles. This can be an empowerment of people and community with a proactive approach, recognizing its own capacities and coping mechanisms. Then community level participation of people becomes effective in disaster management. And because if there is community based disaster preparedness, definitely the participation becomes very effective now, because they maybe the history have taught them about the disasters. They do have some sort of indigenous knowledge. They do have some sort of indigenous wisdom, so that they can tackle that kind of disasters or hazards. Government and non-government agencies have supportive and facilitating role. So definitely the government agencies will be facilitating some help, supportive help. Then communities can reduce their vulnerability and increase capacity, configuring disaster mitigation with local development planning. Okay, let's just take a break of 5 to 10 minutes, then we'll continue. Hello, welcome back. So we have discussed about different components and what are the different principles. Then let's understand what are the different approaches or operational steps in the community-based disaster management. So community-based disaster management that basically involve in disaster preparedness and quick response, collection of baseline information, situational analysis and database, generation about the community, their assets, resources, and opportunities. Now, hazard analysis, vulnerability assessment, and risk profiling, preparation of community contingency plan, awareness generation, capacity building on various themes of disaster management, mock drills and rehearsals. So all these are basically approaches and operational steps that should be done in community-based disaster management, and we have already discussed about all this. And now steps of planning. So what should be the steps of planning first? We need to understand what are the different experiences that community is having right now from the past, from the history. If they have experienced some sort of, let's say, disasters in the past, any kind of cyclones, any kind of earthquakes, any kind of flood, or drought, or anything, if they have they have experienced these kind of things, then they will be having some sort of indigenous knowledge about how to mitigate the impacts, how to reduce the effects of the disaster. So this should be the first step for planning. Then you do have situation analysis. So what is the situation? I mean, the information about population, the geographical area. What are the different characteristics of the geographical area? I mean, whether it is a hilly region, whether it is a slopy region. Then habitation. What are the different facilities and services that is available to that region? Whether the transport and communication facility is fine. So all these kind of things will be included under your situational analysis. Then techniques to be adopted is basically mapping and listing. I mean, um, if if you have came across any research papers regarding, let's say, earthquakes, the flood, then landslide susceptibility, all these kind of mapping is basically done by different researchers, mostly from the geographical background, mostly from geography, and other peoples are also doing just like civil engineering department, then the people from geology. So they are also studying about the disaster management, and other institutions, I mean the scientists, and all the academicians, other academicians which are related to the disaster management. So they are studying and mapping different types of maps, so that it will be beneficial for disaster risk reduction. And then social mapping. I mean, social mapping is very necessary. It is basically just like our census. So the disaster prone area should be marked, and the social vulnerabilities should be understood properly. Now, if it is no information is available about the number of houses, what are the different number of pakka houses and kacha houses, then the road availability, the water facilities, whether drinking water facilities are available or not, Then community infrastructure. So which are the different infrastructures which are available to that community? If that region is basically disaster prone region, then there should be, community centers. There should be some shelters for, un, uh, to tackle, let's say let's say cyclone, just like we do have cyclone shelters, rivers, canals. So all this kind of mapping is also need to be done. Then hazard analysis and mapping. I mean, the zoning. I mean, which zones are more vulnerable to, let's say, landslide, or which regions will be much more vulnerable to, let's say, cyclones. I mean, the current cyclone. Let's say, take an hypothetical example of cyclone originating from Bay of Bengal, and that gonna hit the Puri coast. Okay, so now although it may get shifted towards north, and we may see, we may no, I mean the Kendrapada or maybe the Bhadrak or the Baleswar region. So all these region may uh, have an impact, but it can actually it can actually map, which areas will be more affected. So that mapping and that hazard mapping need to be done properly. So then vulnerability assessment. So we have already discussed about the vulnerability, and it need to be assessed properly. Then a group formation and mobilizing the community for joint action. I mean, the community-based disaster management is all about that. I mean, dividing different roles and responsibilities so that they can act in different groups, and let's say evacuating people. So you need different groups. I mean, all the people cannot follow where is cyclone shelters. Now where we need to go. So all these kind of activities need to be done by community members and who are well informed. So mitigation strategy for a disaster, no, sorry, reducing the risk. We'll need to take some mitigation strategies for reducing the risk. So this is an important part of your planning part. Okay. So now let's suppose people who are living nearby the river valleys, or they are living in floodplain regions, then artificial embankments can be done so that the water discharge, the volume of water discharge can be increased, so that the the banks, both the banks will not be flooded. So this kind of mitigation strategies can be done, or maybe dams can be constructed across the river, and reservoirs can be made. So all this kind of mitigation measures can be taken. Okay. Then sustainability of community-based approaches. What are the different challenges of community-based disaster management? I mean, ensuring compatibility of community interests with interests of other stakeholders, proper resource mobilization, and community empowerment. So all these are basically different challenges that is basically faced by faced no uh, for your community-based disaster management. Now, the political environment. I mean, if the political environment is unstable and it is not stable, then the government facilities that should have been provided will not be provided properly. If there will be corruption, then the relief facilities will be delayed, or very meager facilities will be provided. So all these kind of things uh, basically take place. Okay. Then reluctance of dominant local leaders to delegate decision making power to the community. So some of the local leaders, they don't want to participate in these kind of activities. Then documentation and regular updating is basically not done properly. Capacity building and complex impact assessment. So this is another problem. I mean, the capacity building is a challenge. I mean, we although we can simply do community based disaster management, and that is one of the suitable approaches to to face any disasters. So then we do have geological hazards. I'll not be telling a lot of things about this now because these are very well known. I mean, you know about landslide, avalanches, then earthquake, volcanic eruption, tsunami. So these are the different things that we'll be discussing here. Okay, so different types of geological hazard. You do have terrain instability hazard. Terrain instability hazards just like your landslide. Terrain means what? Your earth. Okay. So landslide. So mud flow, then ground sinking and slow ground creep. All rock falling. All these kind of things are basically terrain instability hazards. Then hydrometeorological hazards. Hydrometeorological hazards are basically related to uh, all the cyclones kind of activities, just like tornado, hurricane, cyclones, then uh, drought. Drought can be hydrological, drought can be meteorological also. Meteorological is basically related to climate, while hydrological is basically related to your water. Then seismic hazard, so you do have earthquake, and then you do have the tsunami, because tsunami basically occur because of earthquakes in mid-oceanic regions. Okay, so that is why tsunami is occur. Then volcanic hazard. Volcanic hazard is basically volcanic eruption and other related hazards, just like the mud flow, then ash, then falling ash, flowing lava, and it will basically when the lava will erupt from the interior of the earth, so definitely it will be bringing some poisonous gases, and that that will act as a pollutant to the atmosphere also. So all these kind of hazards are basically your volcanic hazards. So what are landslides? Landslides are predominantly found in hilly and mountainous regions, and this can be properly seen in the Himalayan regions. Now, although the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghat region do have some sort of landslide activities, but not that much. Just like uh, the Himalayan region. Now, why? Now, because uh, the Himalayan mountain range is basically young, okay, very young, and the no the material it is consisting of is not that consolidated. I mean, look at the Aravalli, look at the Vindhyas and the Satpura range, look at the Western Ghat, even the Eastern Ghat. So we do have granitic rocks. So those are pretty hard. I mean, the landslide, uh, the occurrence of landslide is less as compared to the Himalayan regions now, because the Himalayan regions are basically consisting or characterized by unconsolidated materials. So that is why the vulnerability actually increases there. Now the vulnerability of landslide increases in those areas in Himalayan regions. So what are the different characteristics of landslide? So it depends upon what is the material type, then slope stiffness. I mean, if the slope will be more, then the impact of landslide will be more. Then variability in size, speed, and movement. So that also defines the landslide activity. I mean, if the size is more, the landslide size is very large, then that will create other problems. Then volumes and say environmental and human impact. So how it is impacting the environment and human? I mean, the transportation and communication facilities are disrupted. I mean, um, I have visited Simla, Manali, then Ladakh, and in the Sikkim Himalayas also I have visited no Nat Natula, then Canggu Lake, and the Gantak region. So All these regions, all these Himalayan regions are actually susceptible to landslide activity. I do remember, uh, waiting for I think 8 to 10 hours for some sort of landslide activity to be cleared while traveling to Ladakh. Okay, so that happens in those regions. What are the factors which are responsible for landslide activity? So there are different natural factors and man-made factors also, so which are causing the landslide activities. What are the natural factors? So if there is heavy rainfall, so rainfall is one of the regions. Then you do have earthquakes. If earthquake will occur, definitely it will bring landslides. Volcanic eruption. So definitely, if the volcanic eruption will occur, now let's suppose in those regions where in mountains and hilly regions, then what will happen? So all the materials of the mountain will be deposited in other parts. So that will create landslide. Then um, slope angle. I sometimes what happens, the slope of the terrain. Okay, if the slope of the terrain is very high, then that can also create landslide activity. What are the human-induced causes, just like deforestation? How deforestation actually is a causative factor for landslide activity? Now, because deforestation, whenever you are cutting down trees, the roots of the trees are basically binding the materials of the uh, the slopes. So whenever you are cutting down trees, uh, you are basically exposing the land to the slope. So in a way, what will happen? The landslide will occur. Then mining and quarrying. So if mining and quarrying activities will be done, and with, let's say, some sort of rainfall activity, those mining and quarrying activity can actually lead to landslide activity. Then agricultural practices also can lead to some extent the landslide activity in hilly and mountainous regions. Sometimes we are doing terrace cultivation. No, agricultural practice. I mean the grazing, so that can also bring the landslide. Construction activities, so cutting down slopes, adding loads through construction can directly affect the landslide. Okay. Avalanches are basically larger landslides. Just think about a big portion of the mountains. Those are basically falling down the slope. That is basically avalanche. And avalanche is much more, that can be tectonic in nature, so that will be basically natural. So different characteristics has been given here, and these are very prominent in ice cap regions, avalanches. Okay, so uh, you can see here, snow will be deposited over there, and over time, what will happen? The avalanche will occur. So what are the positive factors? Basically, terrain factor. If then slope angle, then aspect is basically to which the slope is basically facing. I mean, if the slope angle is more, then the probability of occurrence of the uh, the avalanche will be more. So definitely, if it is more than, let's say, 60 degree, or it is between 30 to 45 degrees, so the steeper slopes definitely will be having more avalanche activities. All these things are pretty easy. It is, how can we manage the avalanches? So first we need to take mitigation measures. Then we need to forecast and monitor the avalanche activities. I mean, uh, there is
There are things like the research instruments where through the use of remote sensing and GIS, we can study about the avalanche activity and the landslide activity. So whenever we are taking data from the satellite imageries and we are proposing a model that these regions are basically vulnerable to avalanche activities and these regions are vulnerable to the landslide activities. So what we are basically doing, I mean, certain if we know that certain regions are vulnerable to avalanche activity, then what we can simply do, and in let's say at a certain period of time, let's say in during winter time, the avalanche activity occurs. So what we can do, we can take different remote sensing data and we can study whether the avalanche will occur or not. We need to uh, quantitatively model that thing using the remote sensing data. So in a way, what will happen? We can simply forecast or predict those activities before it occurs. So mapping and land use planning, then the risk assessment and early warning system. So preparedness and emergency response, then research and technology that should be uh, playing a major role in tackling the avalanches. Then earthquake is basically the shaking of earth, and what are the characteristics? Focus or hypocenter, epicenter, do you know all these things?
Yes, sir. Epicenter means the middle point.
Middle point of what?
The seismic wave that arises from the point that is the epicenter.
Seismic wave arising from a point, that is epicenter.
Yes, sir.
That is basically focus or hypocenter. Epicenter is basically the point on the ground.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, or I am confused. You are right. Okay, so hypocenter or focus is basically an earthquake wave originates from a particular point beneath the Earth's surface. So that is basically hypocenter. Epicenter is basically and basically earthquakes occur in the interior of the Earth. So from which point it originates, that is basically the focus, or that is basically the hypocenter. But epicenter is basically on the ground. It will be reaching the ground, the first point or the shortest distance. So it is basically covering, that is basically the epicenter. Okay. Then focal depth. Focal depth is also known as earthquake depth or hypocenter depth. It is the vertical measurement from Earth's surface to earthquake's focus. That is basically focal depth. I mean, to what distance? What is the distance between the focus and focus, the hypocenter and the epicenter? Then epicentral distance, same thing. Seismic shadow zones. I think you know about these shadow zones. Anybody knows about the shadow zones? I mean, the seismograph cannot record, you know, the waves, the seismic waves in a location. Okay, so that is basically the area between 103 degree to 143 degree. Okay, so in between these regions, the seismic waves are not recorded. So these regions are known as shadow zones. And intensity and magnitude of earthquakes. So intensity is basically measured in Mercalli scale, while the magnitude is basically measured in the Richter scale. So you do have different scales to measure the intensity and magnitude. What are the positive factors? Factors are basically tectonic causes. So because of um, no tectonic movement, tectonic plate movement, so there can be earthquake. So it just like the convergent, there are basically three types of plate boundaries. No, first one is your convergent plate boundary, then divergent plate boundary, and a transform plate boundary. So convergent and divergent plate boundaries, both they can create earthquakes. Then fault formation, if the fault will occur, definitely there will be earthquake activity. Volcanic eruption, if volcanic eruption will occur, definitely it will be shaking the earth, and that will create the earthquake activity. Earth compression, earth, so as heat gradually radiates from the earth's interior, the earth crust cools and contracts. So mostly this happens because of the seasonality. The seasonality. So that is why expansion contraction. You do understand about expansion and contraction. If a lot of heat will be released from our Earth's interior, then it will be it will be much more compact. Okay, so that may be a cause for earthquake activity. Then a non-tectonic activities like landslide, avalanches, or meteorite impact. So these kind of activities can also bring earthquake. So what are the human-induced causes? Just like construction of dams, mining activity, or nuclear explosion. So these are pretty easy. I mean, nuclear activity and mining activity. I mean, if the mining roof will be collapsed, then definitely there will be earthquake activities. And if nuclear explosion will occur, definitely the earthquake will occur. And how construction of dams actually create the is basically responsible for earthquake. Anybody who can actually say me
Sir,
how
sir,
construction of
please.
dams
Yes, sir.
is responsible for earthquakes, occurrence of earthquakes?
Sir, the water can cause the earthquake because the volume of water and the mass of water that present at the construction dam when it releases or the impact it on the floor that can cause.
Okay, so that is an interesting point. Okay, so that may be a cause, but have you studied about the isostacy? I mean, when we are basically constructing a dam across a river, what actually happens? You are disturbing the isostatic balance of that region. I mean, let's suppose you can eat, let's say, 500 grams of chicken. So what will happen? You can simply eat. I will be giving you 500 grams of chicken, and you'll simply be eating that 500 grams of chicken. And if I'll be giving you 750 grams of chicken, and I'll be instructing you to complete it at one go, then what will happen? Either you may vomit or something else may happen. Okay, so that is basically a reaction that at 500 grams of chicken you are at complete balance, you are at complete equilibrium. So that is why now there is no effect or no reaction that is coming from your body. But the same thing actually happens here. The isostatic balance basically get disturbed. And also what the interesting point that you have made, the volume, the mass of that volume of water that is exerting pressure on the earth. So that may create some problem. And that is basically creating or disturbing the isostacy of that region. So that is why in reaction, this kind of earthquakes may occur. So how earthquakes can be managed? disaster management. So first you need to do earthquake risk mapping, land use planning, earthquake prediction, early warning systems. Now, although there are warning systems for earthquake, but uh, most of the warning systems miserably failed actually. Now because it is very sudden and reacting to earthquake warning systems is pretty impossible actually. No, it is not that possible. We can simply say that warnings can be issued, but reacting to those warnings will not be easy. I mean, just like cyclones. I mean, cyclones. Once the warning has been issued, the people of that region will get ample amount of time to evacuate those regions and get themselves prepared for the cyclonic activity. So in a way, what happens? A lot of people basically have lesser impacts of the cyclones. So, still technology need to be developed and proper warning systems need to be developed. Then public awareness and education. So these are pretty common points. It actually needs no explanation. Then precautionary measures. What are the precautionary measures that you should be taking? Post disaster management. Post disaster management is basically about the rescue and relief operation. I think have you gone through the news of Papua New Guinea, so which is basically nearby the Australia, and that
Yes, sir.
country. Uh, no, recently one of the devastating earthquakes has occurred, and that actually had further impacts on landslides, and a lot of people were buried inside. Okay, so this kind of news you should be learning. As anything you are preparing now, whether you are preparing for an academics, whether you are a civil servant aspirant, or whether you are looking for, let's say, any kind of job. So no news and relating to your subject. So that is one of the important things that you should be learning. Okay, so rescue and relief operations that need to be done post disaster management, this is basically about, and recovery, reconstruction and rehabilitation of the rehabilitation of different people now, because they will be losing their property, they might have lost their property, so they need to be rehabilitated by the government. Then reconstructional and recovery activities need to be done in a very quick time. So sadly these kind of activities is very on hypothetical level it is fine, on theoretical level it is fine, but on practical level this is not properly done still now. What I believe, I have seen, I have read different case studies about earthquakes and cyclones and other kind of disasters, and when they already had the serious impacts, still maybe because of no not very active government is there, and but still this need to be done. Then volcanic eruption is basically the coming out of the magma that is basically coming out from the interior of the earth. And if you have any some ideas about the interior of the earth, so you should be knowing about the asthenosphere. So asthenosphere is basically semi-liquid sphere in between sorry in upper mantle. Okay, so in upper mantle, and that is where actually we the crust is basically floating over that, so that is why we are having the tectonic movements. Okay, so the plates, the movement of plates, the oceanic plates or the continental plates, those are basically moving what moving over that sphere, over that layer. Now, because that is basically a semi-liquid layer, so that is why it is floating. All the plates are basically floating on the astronosphere. So those are basically molten magmas. And if you do understand the sea floor spreading, um, there is a concept of subduction zone, and how the new kiosks are basically formed, and how the subduction zone, the materials from the subduction zone again get into the asthenosphere, and it is again get molted, and again the similar kind of cycles actually take place in seafloor spreading. That has been given by, I believe, Harry Hess, or yeah, Harry Hess. So that from that asthenosphere, the magma basically comes out, and because of different reason, maybe you will be having some kind of vents, or some pressure that is being exerted. So this kind of activities actually bring the volcanic eruption. So what could be the causative factors, just like the decompression of the Earth's surface? Now, as as we have already discussed about the compression of the Earth's surface, so because of heat, because of seasonality, now because we do have summers, we do have winters, so in between even we do have some rainy periods also. So because of summers and winters, Earth actually receives different temperature conditions. So definitely, if heat will be more, then Earth will expand, and if there will be a very low temperatures, then the Earth will contract. So that is basically, if the Earth will expand, so there may be a chance that the materials from the mantle that actually moves upward to fill the void that has been created. Okay, then magma accumulation. If So that is why now here, to understand these causes, you need to understand that seafloor spreading, and you need to understand the subduction zone, the concept of subduction zone, how these materials get into the asthenosphere, and they get melted. If the magma will be accumulated, in a very large region or area, then definitely it will be no, it will come out. Okay. Even there are few hotspots, like you might have heard about Hawaii Islands. Hawaii Island is very famous. That is, famous for its scenic beauty, and a lot of tourists actually visit Hawaii Island. And
It's a
so
ring
these are
of fire.
basically hotspots. Ring of Fire.
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes. The Ring of Fire is actually, Ring of Fire is, that is one of the concepts which is mostly related to, I believe, earthquakes and volcanic activity.
Yes, sir.
So even you do have plate movements. Plate movements can also cause volcanic eruption also. Manage. So the same pre-disaster management can be done. Okay, so preparedness. What are the different types of mapping that we need to do? So mapping hazard zones, mapping risk zones, to which areas are more vulnerable towards the volcanic activity that need to be mapped. And so these are different points still that need to be done. Prediction of volcanic eruption. Understanding the seismic activity is very difficult. I mean, predicting volcanic eruption is also very difficult. Then post disaster management, I mean, the same things again. Okay, so if you do understand what do you mean by disasters, and these are the important points that you need to understand. What is the pre-disaster management that we need to do? First, what are the different things that need to be done to mitigate the impact of disasters? Then, what are the post-disaster management that can be done? And I mean, the points will be pretty much similar for every disaster management. Okay, although there will be few exceptions, just like drought. For drought, there may be different post-disaster management. So you need to understand that. Then tsunami. Okay, so tsunami that basically occurs because of earthquake activity in mid-oceanic parts, and these are basically a result of the tectonic movements or tectonic activities. So India have also experienced, I believe, tsunami. You know where which part of India actually experienced tsunami? So those are basically geophysical hazards. These are hydrometeorological hazards. So within hydrometeorological hazards, you do have floods, tropical cyclones, drought, cloud burst, heat waves and cold waves, then lightning. So heat waves are well experienced by the people of Odisha. I believe the summers are right now is unbearable. Then lightning activity. So all these are basically hydrometeorological hazards. So let's first understand what is flood. Flood is basically the overflow of inland or tidal water. I mean, so when the water from the river comes out of its bank because of the discharge of water is very less, maybe so and the flow of water is more. When the flow is more than the discharge of water at a certain cross section of the drainage system or a river, then definitely it will spill out. Definitely it will come out. So that process is basically known as your flood activities. And there are flood prone regions, and flood prone regions are mostly if you know three stages of rivers, then you will understand that a river have three stages. First is your young or youth, then you have matured stage and old stage. So within your matured stage and old stage, most of the flood activities occurs. Now, because what happens, the sediments that has been brought by the rivers will be deposited somewhere in the path, and it enters the plain area when the river becomes mature. So what will happen if it is a plain area? So then it will follow the path of lowest elevation, but still, if the flow of the water will be more, then the water discharge will be less. So that is why the flood may occur. And these are pretty easy, floodplains. Then flash flood. What is the meaning of flash flood? Flash flood means sudden occurrence of flooding activity. I mean, uh, just think about a situation where no, can anyone give an example of flash flood? Where has occurred.
So Kedarnath cloud burst can be an example of flash flood or not?
Flash flood, yeah, we can actually give that example also. Now because that କେଦାରନାଥରେ କଣ ଥିଲା କି ଉପରେ actually ଗୋଟେ reservoir type ର ଥିଲା, ତ କ୍ଲାଉଡ ବର୍ଷ୍ଟ ହେଲା ପରେ ସେ reservoir ରୁ ବି ପାଣି ପଳେଇ ଆସିଲା, ତ ସେଟା ବି flash flood ହେଇପାରିବ.
Sir, glacial lake outburst flood can be an example or not?
What? I didn't go to your point.
Glacial lake
Glacial,
outburst, glacial lake outburst flood.
huh, that can be considered as flash flood. If any kind of sudden flood activity, that will basically be considered as flash flood. I mean, if a dam will be let's say disrupted, maybe just think about those kind of situations ଯୋଉଠି actually water ବହୁତ ଜଲ୍ଦି spill out କରିବ ଆଉ যদি କିଛି ଡ୍ୟାମ ଭାଙ୍ଗିଗଲା ତାହେଲେ ଫ୍ଲାଶ ଫ୍ଲଡ୍ ହବାର ଚାନ୍ସେସ୍ ଅଛି ହେଲା।
Yes, sir.
Then these are basically types. Okay, so types, flash flood is one type. Then river flooding. River flooding is very easy. I mean, the flood which is occurring because of the water, coming out of its, the course, and it. Just a minute. Okay, so this river flooding is basically prominent and the mature stage regions and the plain areas are basically uh, characterized by this kind of river flooding. And do do anyone know that the sorrow of Bihar, then sorrow of West Bengal, and why?
The Kosi River and Damodar River.
Yeah, good. So why these rivers are basically considered as the sorrow of Bihar and West Bengal?
Sir, they change their path frequently
Yeah.
year to year.
Yes. 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 So why basically that happens now? Because you know they bring immense uh, sediments from the upper course. Okay. So what will happen when they enter the plain area? So few of the sediments will be deposited. That will basically obstruct the course of the river. So the river may turn left or the river may bend. So the meandering will start. So in a way, basically the river course basically change over a period of time. So that is why it brings. That is why these are considered to be the sorrows of these two states. Then other types of flooding, you do have coastal flooding because of the tidal activity. You know about the tidal activity, so that brings coastal flooding. Then urban flooding is a contemporary concept, and urban flooding is very popular nowadays now because uh, few of the important cities have faced urban flooding because of improper drainage facilities. Now, because the when the water will not be discharged properly, definitely there will be flooding. So Chennai is one of the greatest examples. Tropical cyclones. I mean, Odisha people and the coast. The people of Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, and West Bengal of India, they know what do you mean by cyclones. Okay, and how to manage. The coastal people mostly understand the cyclonic activity. What are the characteristics? It depends upon the size and pressure, intensity, mobility. Okay, let's complete it here. We'll have another class tomorrow. We'll
The
try to
cyclone
complete.
occurs at a specific temperature. The temperature is 30 or 32 degrees Celsius or what? I can remember.
Cyclones.
Sir, occur at a specific temperature.
Cyclones.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah. No, 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 it's not specific temperature. I mean, you can have higher temperatures also. Actually, that will help in creating intensifying that low pressure. I mean, we do understand that there is an inverse relationship between temperature and pressure. So, cyclonic activity in northern hemisphere is basically what? Is basically a intensified low pressure zone or intensified low pressure area. And if there will be high temperature, that can actually help the cyclone to be formed. Any other points?
No, sir.
Okay, okay, then we'll discuss tomorrow. And tomorrow, actually, we are left with two blocks. So we'll try what we can do. This is it for today. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir.